I want to talk about three aspects of violence that critical psychology might have something to say about. This isn't to say that critical psychology can solve these questions, but there are some concepts that we might bring to bear on the question of violence. And the first is our understanding of the political economic context in which violence is happening today globally, something that affects all of us wherever in the world we are. And this is the condition of neoliberal capitalism. Neoliberal capitalism has three aspects. The first is the reduction to the level of the individual of social phenomena, so that individuals feel responsible for those processes that are taking place in the political and economic sphere. And this plays out not only in the way that people are categorized and understood by the therapeutic services, but in the way that therapy comes to be located inside the individual as an experiential force, so that people understand themselves as being individually responsible. The second aspect, which goes alongside this reduction to the level of the individual, which surely is something that psychology must reflect on. The second aspect is the stripping back of welfare state services, so that the levels of therapeutic and social support that are given by the state in the social democratic countries particularly, but also to an extent across the world, those welfare services and social support services are being stripped back. The third aspect of neoliberalism, which is extremely important for the project of critical psychology, is the imposition of a strong state. Sometimes this is overlooked in analysis of neoliberalism, and in discussions of neoliberalism in critical psychology, there's a tendency to simply focus on the first two aspects, that is, the reduction to the individual and the stripping back of the welfare state. But the imposition of the strong state is the third component that we also need to be aware of. And that bears, of course, on the question of violence, not only in the imposition in a brutal way of a clampdown on protest and dissent by the state, but also the brutalization of poverty. The brutalization of poverty in the way that people are compelled to account for themselves as individual to state services, to explain why they don't have a job, for example, to account for their inability to look after their families. And this imposition of the strong state plays out not only at the political economic level, but plays out at the personal level as well. Each individual is encouraged to become a strong individual, like a micro version of the state. As always in political economy under capitalism, the processes that are happening in the macroeconomic sphere are also played out in miniature at the personal level. And so we see people who are concerned with constructing defenses becoming, as they say in some parts of contemporary psychology today, tough-minded, mental toughness being one motif that is rolled out by psychologists to make people into self-contained individuals. The second aspect that I want to talk about is the question of segregation. And it's a question of segregation that bears on the way that we think about testimony. It's something that has emerged from the attempts to deal with violence following the fall of apartheid in South Africa in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where there are some important lessons to be learnt there, not only about the way that politics is reduced in some way to a therapeutic process of accounting, witnessing, and giving testimony of one's experience of violence, but also the segregation of experience means that there are certain questions that can be asked by the Truth and Reconciliation committees and certain questions that are left to the side. We know, for example, that many communities in South Africa, the black communities, attempted to give witness and testimony to their experience of violence. And many of the individuals wanted to talk about the ways in which violence was being experienced by them at a familial level and a community level, which had nothing to do precisely with the way in which the state had acted under apartheid. And of course, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was concerned with the activities of the state, eventually including activities of the state in the segregation of communities, the clearing of the homes in the townships. But many of the participants in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission hearings wanted to talk about things like domestic violence, what had happened when their partners had left them, what had happened when their partners had been killed, what had happened when their partners were deeply affected by the structural violence and played out that violence at a familial level in the domestic sphere. And they were told that this wasn't something that they should talk about. So there's a segregation of experience, and there's a risk here in every truth and reconciliation process that the segregation of experience means that people are told not only how they should speak, but they are told that they should speak only about certain aspects of their lives that are of interest to the professionals who are assisting them in the truth and reconciliation process. And this is something that psychologists need to be aware of when they're being involved in any kind of truth and reconciliation process of this kind. The third aspect that we might have something to say about is the question, a conceptual question, of how we deal with different domains of human experience. How we treat, first of all, the question of the real brutality, the destruction of bodies, the destruction of lives, the death of people in communities that have been affected by state violence and also by paramilitary violence, which is encouraged by the state. A paramilitary violence that is as important, and we can see this in the case of the north of Ireland, for example, where paramilitary forces were funded, infiltrated, and encouraged by the British state in order to murder Republican nationalist, Irish nationalist activists. And we can see similar things happening in other parts of the world, in El Salvador, for example, where murders of activists who were protesting against state repression were murdered by the paramilitary forces that were, it turns out, funded and organized directly by the state. But this real aspect of violence is an aspect of violence that is inexplicable to those involved, that is very difficult to give meaning to. And here is the question, of course, of what is known in clinical psychology and psychiatry as trauma. Trauma is an effect of the real violence, the inexplicable violence, the unsymbolizable violence, the violence that can't be integrated into experience, that needs to be addressed using conceptual resources that are political, economic, sociological, even we might say also literary resources, which analyze the ways in which the violence is being conducted and the way that the violence is being configured in the media, as if in some cases the violence doesn't exist, or as if the violence is the responsibility of the communities who have been targeted. A second aspect of this question of violence that we should conceptualize is precisely about the way that it is experienced, the way that it is given imaginary form, the way in which individuals account for their lives as individuals and as members of communities, so that they're able to configure the violence in a personal or community narrative that that is part of the testimony that they might give in something like a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Now, this imaginary level of violence, I think, should also be taken extremely seriously. It's not something to be discounted as being merely imaginary, but it's an imaginary level of violence that has a real impact on the communities and has a real impact on the symbolic level as well. We can see examples of this in the testimony of experience of violence that is given by indigenous peoples around the world, where they give accounts of their experience which are about what has personally happened to them. And I'm thinking here just of one example, the case of Rigoberta Menchú, who talked about her experience of violence and was then accused of fabricating the accounts because the journalists delving around into the details of the violence were then able to claim that these events hadn't actually happened to Rigoberta Menchú, but had happened to other members of the community and maybe to her family. And that's precisely the point that Rigoberta Menchú made in responding to these accusations of fraud, that there's a different notion of memory at work in some communities that we need to take seriously. And that dimension of memory and experience is configured in a different way. It's not configured in the way that we, as Western psychologists, would expect it to be configured, but is configured on a collective level. So we have to take seriously violence at the imaginary level, at the experiential level, that is configured collectively as well as personally. The third aspect, which I've hinted at already, is of course the symbolic aspect, the different forms of violence that provide the context in which people can make sense of what is being done to them by the state apparatus and by the paramilitary forces, and also integrate that inexplicable violence into their own personal and community narratives. And that symbolic violence is a symbolic violence that we need to take seriously as psychologists in the way that we draw on a series of debates across the social sciences and the human sciences, which look not only at material embodied violence, at the destruction of bodies, but also take seriously what we might call interpretative violence, the ways in which forms of violence in the representation of different communities, of different marginalized groups, of different subcultures, of different sexual minorities, different ethnic minorities, are routinely misrepresented in the media and in the academic literature as well. And to take this seriously as a form of symbolic violence that we need to make part of our scholarly work and our solidarity work with those who've been affected by violence in the different communities. Now, these three different elements of violence that I've been talking about, neoliberalism, the segregation of experience, and the distinction between the real, imaginary, and symbolic, are of course key issues for psychologists. But my claim is that it is only critical psychology that takes these issues seriously. We can't define to the satisfaction of psychologists exactly what critical psychology is, because critical psychology is different in South Africa, it's different in Turkey, it's different in Kurdistan, it's different in Brazil and in Spanish-speaking Latin America. And we need to draw on the different resources in critical psychology in order to answer these questions. Not one critical psychology, but a critical psychological explanation of violence that takes seriously neoliberalism, segregation, and the three different domains of human experience.